My family had written me off as a failure. I sat quietly at my brother's governor's gala, lips sealed. Then the governor leaned over, stared at me and said, "Wait, you're her." The room went still. Even my father was left speechless. A single whisper, "Wait, you're Senator Reynolds?" undid years of family betrayal. Governor Blackwell's eyes widened. Across the hall, Ryan, my golden boy brother, went pale. In that moment, the label of family disappointment that had followed me for years finally started to crumble. If people who should have believed in you doubted you, keep listening. This is how being underestimated turned into my advantage. Growing up a Reynolds in Boston carried weight. Our name was on university buildings, featured in society pages, and opened doors that stayed shut for others. The Reynolds legacy was old money, banking, influence, and a relentless focus on appearances. My parents, Robert and Elizabeth Reynolds, had a clear blueprint for their children: straight A's, an Ivy League degree, a respectable career in finance or law, a good marriage, and never under any circumstance a scandal. From the start, Ryan fit that blueprint perfectly. Handsome, athletic, and charming, he instinctively mastered the unspoken rules of our world. When he brought home top grades, my father glowed. When he became lacrosse captain, my mother hosted a lavish party. I was different, not openly defiant, but inquisitive in ways that made them uncomfortable. Where Ryan accepted our family worldview, I kept asking why. While he flirted at country club events, I lost myself in books about history and government. My parents humored what they called my intellectual phase, assuming I'd eventually conform. The first serious crack came in my sophomore year of high school. An English project required analyzing a current political issue. Most classmates chose safe topics. I picked a controversial environmental policy that affected companies tied to our family's investments. My research was thorough, my analysis careful, and the grade reflected that. But instead of praise, my parents were alarmed when another parent mentioned it at a charity event. "Do you know how this looks?" my father demanded that night, pacing our mahogany-paneled study. "The Harringtons, Kennedy are considering a partnership with us, and now they think we've raised a radical environmentalist," he said. I argued the data showed harm. "Isn't truth important?" My mother gave me that familiar look of disappointment. "Darling, there's truth and there's what's appropriate. Learn the difference." That became the pattern. When I joined the debate team instead of cheerleading, it was impractical. When I chose political science over business or pre-law, it was rebellious. Every choice that diverged from the Reynolds script felt like a personal affront to the family legacy. By senior year, the contrast with Ryan was stark. He had an early acceptance to Harvard and moved through life with the easy certainty of someone who never questioned the plan. I, meanwhile, became drawn to social justice and political reform, volunteering at a local campaign office, and becoming fascinated by how policy was made. There, people didn't care about my last name. They cared about my ideas and work ethic. For the first time, I felt valued for who I was, not how well I conformed. When college applications came, I made a decision that changed everything between my parents and me. Though I had the grades and connections for any Ivy, I picked a respected state university with an excellent political science program. When I told them, my father's face flushed. "You're throwing away opportunities people would kill for," he said quietly. "This isn't just about you, it's about generations of Reynolds before you." "I'm not throwing anything away," I answered. "I'm choosing a different path. A path to nowhere," my mother scoffed. "Political science? What does that even lead to?" They couldn't see that I'd found something they hadn't valued: a sense of purpose beyond money and status. In their eyes, I'd committed the ultimate sin, rejecting the life prescribed for me. That fall, as Ryan packed for Harvard and relatives celebrated him, I left for UMass. The night I left, my grandmother Grace slipped me a note. "Be brave enough to be different. Someone has to." It was the only family encouragement I received, and I held on to it like a talisman. UMass was nothing like Harvard's ivy-covered halls. Merit mattered more than lineage, and a variety of perspectives was welcomed. For the first time, I felt free. My freshman political theory class with Professor Diana Mitchell, a former legislative director, proved pivotal. When she challenged my take on a Supreme Court decision, I knew I'd found a mentor who would push me. "You have a natural instinct for policy analysis," she told me after class. "But you must trust your voice. Your ideas matter, Miss Reynolds." Those words, simple, profound, were like water in a desert. No one in my family had ever told me my ideas mattered. They only cared how my ideas reflected on them. While I immersed myself in political theory, Ryan thrived at Harvard. My parents' social media became a non-stop feed of his business school events, internships, and networking. Our paths diverged further. In my sophomore year, I joined a campus group focused on educational equity. We organized calmly, researched carefully, and presented data-driven solutions to the administration. When our work resulted in more scholarships for low-income students, I felt a fulfillment I'd never known: concrete change, not abstract theory. Holiday breaks grew strained. What started as quiet disapproval hardened into outright dismissal. At my junior year Thanksgiving, Ryan talked about his investment bank internship while our parents beamed. "And you?" Aunt Margaret asked during a pause. "Still doing that political thing?" Before I could answer, my father waved it off. "Kennedy is still finding herself. Hopefully she'll get serious before graduation." I swallowed my hurt. "Actually," I said softly, "I've been offered a campaign position for Senator Warner this summer." Silence filled the table, until my mother managed a tight smile. "Will it pay well?" she asked. "It's about experience, not money," I replied. My father scoffed. "Experience doesn't pay student loans." "My scholarships cover most of my tuition," I reminded him, though he already knew. "Those scholarships could have gone to someone who actually needed them if you'd taken Harvard," my mother added, using an old refrain. Professor Mitchell became my refuge. She saw my interest in progressive politics and connected me with hands-on organizing opportunities. Under her guidance, I learned the unglamorous essentials of political work: phone banking, data analysis, voter outreach. "Politics isn't just grand ideas," she said. "It's showing up, doing the work, and building real relationships." By senior year, I'd managed a successful city council campaign for a first-time candidate and was offered a full-time role at a nonprofit focused on voter education. Finally, my unconventional path was producing results. My family saw only a hobby. When I announced my post-grad plans at Christmas, my father reacted sharply. "That's enough," he said, setting down his glass. "We've indulged this hobby for 4 years. It's time to grow up and get a real job." "This is a real job," I insisted. "Important work." "Important to whom?" my mother asked. "Certainly not to this family's reputation." He meant it. The next morning, he told me there would be no financial support after graduation. No help with rent, no family health insurance. "You chose this path," he said. "Deal with the consequences." Ryan watched from the doorway, sympathy and relief mixed on his face. In that moment, I realized he was as constrained by family expectations as I had been. He just happened to fit the mold. I returned to campus, determined. Alone in my dorm, I promised to build my own path with or without my family's blessing. I would measure success by impact, not income, and one day they would have to acknowledge my choice. Post-college, my apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up, with unreliable heat and a shared bathroom, a far cry from the Reynolds estate. I lived on a non-profit salary and scrimped each month. Ryan, by contrast, landed a six-figure job at a consulting firm. His social media full of business-class flights and luxury apartments. My family loudly celebrated his rise, while describing my work as an idealistic phase. The nonprofit where I worked was underfunded but crucial. We made educational materials, ran registration drives in underserved neighborhoods, and worked to increase civic participation among young voters. Long hours, small pay, but deeply meaningful outcomes. Family gatherings became endurance tests. At a cousin's wedding, my mother told a friend, "Kennedy is still in her idealistic phase." At Thanksgiving, when Ryan announced a promotion and bonus, They popped champagne. When I shared that our program had increased youth turnout by 12% in recent local elections, my father asked bluntly, "And how does that translate to a career, Kennedy?" "It is my career," I said. "We're making democracy accessible," he replied. "You're 30, living in a substandard apartment, making what 40,000, with your education and connections, this is a waste." The room fell quiet. Even Ryan looked uneasy. "We've watched this experiment for years," my father continued. "You squandered your advantages." I stood, hands trembling. "Success isn't only money, Dad," I said. "In the real world it absolutely is," he shot back. I left, and in my car I finally let myself cry, for the words and for the fear my family might never see the value of my path. 2 weeks later, at a community forum we'd organized, a young single mother approached me. "Before your program I never voted," she said. "Now my daughter sees me research candidates and fill out a ballot. She knows her voice matters." Her words rekindled my faith. This was why I'd chosen this route, to help people see their power in democracy. Around then, I met Logan Mitchell at a political fundraiser. Professor Mitchell's son, a communications director for a progressive state rep, tall with thoughtful green eyes. Logan was the first person who seemed to understand my passion, without doubting it. "So you're the famous Kennedy Reynolds," he said when we were introduced. "My mother says you'll be governor someday." I laughed, but Logan's genuine interest made me feel seen. Our first date turned into a 5-hour conversation about electoral reform, organizing, and a shared vision for a more inclusive democracy. With Logan's support and a growing network, I made a decision that shocked everyone. I would run for city council. At 31, with no family backing and limited funds, it seemed unlikely. But my nonprofit work had built deep community ties, and I understood ordinary residents' problems in ways many politicians didn't. When I told my family, their reactions were predictably derisive. "City council?" my mother repeated. "Be serious. You'll lose and waste the little money you have," father warned. "Have you thought this through?" I had. I had a campaign manager, a treasurer, volunteers, and a plan focused on community engagement. Ryan, who now worked for rising political star James Blackwell, looked uncomfortable and said, "Politics is more complicated than you think." "I know," I replied. My grassroots campaign was the opposite of big budget politics. We worked from a borrowed office, relied on volunteers, and prioritized direct voter contact. I knocked on thousands of doors, listened to residents, and shared a vision for more responsive local government. On election night, Logan and our small team watched the returns at a neighborhood restaurant. When I won by a narrow margin, the room erupted. It was a modest political victory, but it felt monumental. My phone stayed silent that night. No family congratulations despite local coverage. Ryan eventually texted, "Congrats on the council seat. Small pond, but I guess it's a start." My mother's message was similarly backhanded. "We're surprised you won. The district must have low standards." Their inability to recognize my achievement strengthened my resolve. I would demonstrate worth, through public service, that improved lives without relying on the Reynolds name. My first term on the council was a crash course in governing. I learned that good intentions weren't enough. Effective public service required strategy, coalition building, and resilience. I focused on affordable housing, better public transit, and transparency in city government. To my surprise, I discovered a talent for the technical policy work many elected officials avoided: digesting complex reports, finding practical solutions, and building consensus among different stakeholders. My community organizing background helped connect policy to real-world impacts for constituents. 6 months into my term, a local profile praised my effectiveness, despite my youth and lack of old-school connections. The piece barely mentioned my family, only to note I'd carved an independent path from our prominent Boston name. That story put me on the radar of several state political operatives, who began to see me as someone to watch. Meanwhile, Ryan kept rising beside Governor Blackwell. His face showed up frequently in state coverage, always by the governor, always polished and poised. At family gatherings, my parents made sure everyone heard about Ryan's proximity to power. My city council work was treated like a quaint hobby by comparison. At one dinner, Ryan joked about our mother beginning conversations while he sat quietly, picking at his food. Even with that dismissal, my reputation as a capable public servant kept growing. By the end of my first term, I'd led several policy wins that tangibly improved constituents' lives. Local outlets started speculating about higher office when a state Senate seat in my district opened unexpectedly because the incumbent faced health issues. Community leaders and progressive groups urged me to run. It was thrilling and daunting. A statewide race would demand more resources and scrutiny than my council run. After many conversations with Logan, who'd become my life partner and closest political advisor, I entered the race. The night before my announcement, I called my parents, hoping my record might have softened them. My mother's voice went cold when I told her, "Don't you think this has gone far enough?" she asked. I told her this wasn't an adventure. It was my career. She warned that my choices alienated the family and said not to expect any support, financial or otherwise. "I'd been on my own for years," I said. She answered that she'd thought I'd outgrow this phase and suggested distance until I made sensible choices. The call left me realizing I might permanently sacrifice my relationship with them. It was a steep price, but I'd come too far to turn back. The state Senate campaign was brutal. Opponents tried to use my family's estrangement against me, implying even those closest to me doubted my judgment. Anonymous quotes circulated. The Reynolds family had a tradition of service through business and philanthropy, and my approach was unconventional. Through it all, Logan stayed steady. After a particularly hard day, he surprised me by proposing at home, no flash, just sincere words and a simple ring, a partnership of equals. Whatever happened in the election, he said, he believed in me completely. Outspent and facing established rivals, my grassroots message still connected with voters, tired of business-as-usual politics. Election night brought vindication. I won. I had done it without family connections, money or support. At my swearing-in, I scanned the crowd hoping for a change of heart. The only family face there was my grandmother Grace, using a walker and beaming with pride. "I always knew you were meant for something extraordinary," she told me. Her presence mattered, but the absence of my parents and Ryan left a gap that even victory couldn't fill. My first term in the state Senate changed everything. I focused on steady, unflashy work, drafting sound legislation, doing my homework, asking the right questions, and building bipartisan coalitions. The press called me a policy wonk with a purpose, not glamorous, but respected. I concentrated on education, healthcare access, and government transparency, areas where careful work produced real impact. By year 3, I'd sponsored 17 bills that became law, an unusual haul for a first-term senator from the minority party. National party leaders began to notice. Ryan continued his ascent as Governor Blackwell's right hand, frequently appearing in state media as a polished administration spokesperson. My parents' social feeds filled with photos of Ryan and the governor. Our estrangement hardened into full-blown separation. I learned about family events only through Grace, who stayed in touch despite their disapproval. My parents developed a stock answer for questions about me. Kennedy is pursuing her own path, supportive sounding but empty. Logan and I built a life together. We married quietly with friends and political allies. Grace was the lone family member who attended. When my parents declined with a curt note about prior commitments, it felt like the final door closing on reconciliation. An unexpected opportunity came in my 4th year. A U.S. Senate seat opened in a special election after a senior senator retired on health grounds. Party leadership encouraged me to run. I hesitated. A national campaign would bring intense scrutiny of my record and my private life, including the family rift I'd kept largely private. Logan warned, "They'll use your family against you." I knew that, but the timing was critical. Major votes on education and healthcare were looming, and the chance to influence national policy was compelling. I decided to run, but with a deliberate strategy: low media profile, substance over spectacle. Retail politics over splash. My campaign manager, Andrea Clark, admitted it was unconventional, but the public was tired of political celebrity. The campaign demanded discipline. I immersed myself in policy briefings, held small forums instead of large rallies, and declined most national media. We focused on local outlets, where I could discuss issues without being reduced to family drama. Opponents, used to candidates chasing headlines, were thrown off. Internal polling showed my message resonated. Through back channels, I learned Ryan noticed my campaign. As chief of staff, he wielded real power. I later learned my father asked him to quietly undermine my run. Ryan refused, not from loyalty to me, but because he knew meddling could backfire. My parents' attitude slid from disapproval to active embarrassment. They told friends I'd failed at politics and had unrealistic ambitions. Logan held me when family rejection felt especially heavy and said, "They can't accept that you succeeded on your own terms." Security threats also complicated the campaign. As a prominent woman in a charged political climate, I needed precautions. Because I deliberately limited public appearances, many voters supported my platform without often seeing me in person. An odd circumstance that ended up helping. The final weeks were a blur of long days and policy debates. Election night in a hotel conference room, with our closest supporters, felt surreal when the results confirmed a narrow but clear victory. At 36, I became the youngest woman ever elected to represent our state in the U.S. Senate. The celebration was quiet, fitting for a campaign focused on substance. There were no calls from my parents or Ryan. As transition work began, I learned my family had doubled down on the narrative of my failure at social functions. Even as national outlets labeled me a rising talent, their denial reinforced my resolve to keep distance and focus on the job. Swearing into the Senate, hand on the Constitution, I thought of Grace's note, "Be brave enough to be different. Someone has to." I thanked her silently. 6 months into my Senate term, the work consumed me in the best way. I secured spots on the education and healthcare committees, perfect fits for my expertise. Logan and I split time between DC and home. My approach stayed the same, thorough, substantive, focused on results rather than headlines. I built relationships across the aisle, did the homework on complex issues, and kept a relatively low public profile. Outside political circles and even in parts of my home state, I wasn't immediately recognizable, a small luxury in Washington. Then came the invitation, an elegant cream card from Governor James Blackwell, requesting my presence at the governor's annual gala for the Children's Education Foundation. No personal note, a formal invite that likely went to hundreds. I knew Ryan as chief of staff, probably helped with the guest list. Was it an olive branch or simply an oversight? Logan found me weighing it at our kitchen table and asked, "Are you going to go?" I admitted it felt like walking into a lion's den. He suggested it might be time that Daki seeing me as a U.S. Senator could pierce their denial. After a few days, I decided to attend, not to seek reconciliation, but to represent my office with dignity. If my family acknowledged me, fine. If not, I would remain professional. On the night of the gala, I wore a simple black dress. Logan wore a tux. The historic hotel ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers. From the entrance, I saw Ryan working the room in a tailored tuxedo, every inch the political operator. My parents were not there. Perhaps they'd chosen to avoid the awkwardness. We were seated near the back, removed from the governor's table, enough to acknowledge my office but distant enough to minimize drama. Throughout the dinner, I stayed composed, speaking with our table mates, a university president, a hospital administrator, and his wife, a judge I knew from state days. I noticed Ryan across the room leaning in to whisper to Governor Blackwell. He never looked my way. Walking through the ballroom toward the ladies' room, I overheard snippets that tightened my chest. "That's the Reynolds girl. She never quite found her way. Ryan's the successful one. He might run for office soon." Hearing that, despite everything I'd accomplished, reminded me how entrenched their narrative still was. After dessert, Governor Blackwell rose to speak about education and the foundation's work. My thoughts were tangled from what I'd overheard. I barely noticed when he said he would move around the room to personally thank key supporters. Lost in thought, I didn't notice the hush that fell over our corner of the ballroom. Looking up, I saw Governor Blackwell approaching our table, flanked by aides and security. Ryan trailed a step behind, his attention on a notepad instead of the room. The governor stopped at our table and, after a moment of puzzlement, recognition washed over his face. "Wait! You're Senator Reynolds?" he asked quietly. Genuine surprise in his voice. The table went silent. Ryan's head snapped up and his face drained of color as he realized what was unfolding. I stood and extended my hand, measured and professional. "Yes, Governor. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for having me this evening." Governor Blackwell shook my hand warmly. "The Education Bill author," he said. "Your work on the Federal Education Committee has been remarkable. I hadn't expected you here tonight." From the corner of my eye, I watched Ryan freeze. His polished composure slipped to reveal plain shock. Around us, people leaned in, straining to see what would happen next. "I've been meaning to discuss your healthcare access proposal," the governor continued, seemingly unaware of the tension. "It aligns with initiatives we're exploring at the state level. Perhaps we could set up a meeting while you're in state." "I'd welcome that, Governor," I said, holding my composure despite the rising whispers. The governor glanced back toward Ryan, who had finally approached, still pale but steadier. "Ryan, why didn't you mention Senator Reynolds would be attending? We could have arranged a proper welcome." A flash of embarrassment crossed my brother's face. "An oversight on my part. My apologies, Governor," he said. The governor's brow furrowed. "Reynolds, any relation?" Before I could answer, Ryan stepped forward. "Senator Reynolds is my sister." The governor looked surprised. "Your sister? I had no idea." He searched our faces, recalculating whatever narrative he had in his head. "Why haven't you ever mentioned this?" The room watched openly now. In a single, public moment, years of family arrangements and private omissions condensed into an awkward tableau. "Family and politics can be complicated," Ryan offered weakly. "They can," I agreed, stepping in to spare him further discomfort. "But we all serve the public in our own ways." A skilled politician, Governor Blackwell, pivoted smoothly. "Well, this is a delightful discovery. We must have you both at the mansion soon. A family of public servants. Quite remarkable." As he moved on, Ryan and I were left to face what the moment had exposed. "Kennedy," he began slowly, "I didn't know you would be here." "Clearly," I replied evenly. "As a U.S. Senator from this state, it would be unusual to be omitted from the invitation list." "That's not what I meant," he said, visibly uncomfortable. "We should talk, not here, but soon." "Should we?" I asked, meeting his gaze. "After years of silence, after our parents misrepresenting my career to their circle, what should we talk about?" "This isn't the place," he murmured, aware of the attention. "But yes, we should. Things are complicated." "They've always been complicated," I said. "They're also simple. I chose a different path. That shouldn't make me a family pariah." Logan touched my arm gently. The governor's wife was waving at me from across the room. The revelation had already shifted my status at the event. "We'll continue this another time," I told Ryan, straightening my shoulders. "I have people to meet." As I walked away, something lifted. The burden of hiding, of being diminished by my family's story. In that room where I had arrived as the disappointing Reynolds, I was now being recognized as Senator Reynolds, respected on my own merits. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions. Political leaders who'd barely acknowledged me before now sought me out. Business executives asked about my committee work. I remained composed, neither triumphant nor fragile, simply professional. When we left, Governor Blackwell approached again, this time alone. "Senator Reynolds," he said quietly, "forgive my earlier ignorance. Had I known of your relation to my chief of staff, I would have arranged a proper welcome." I deflected the apology. "No apology needed. Family circumstances can be complicated." He nodded. "Having observed your work on education reform, I'm rethinking the narrative I'd heard through certain channels. You're clearly an exceptional public servant." That meant a great deal. As our car pulled away, Logan squeezed my hand. You handled that with grace. I've had years of practice, I said, looking back at the lit hotel. But this feels different, like the truth has finally broken through. The truth was always there, Logan said gently. Now others can see it too. The revelation at the governor's gala rippled beyond that night. By morning, state political blogs had picked up the story about the Reynolds siblings' reunion and speculated about our family dynamics. The public narrative shifted from wondering why I'd been excluded to questioning how my achievements had been downplayed for so long. 3 days after the gala, my office phone rang. The number was familiar. My father's private line. Kennedy, he began without preamble, I understand you attended the governor's gala. I did, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. There was a pause heavy with unspoken years. Your mother and I have been discussing recent developments, he said. We think it might be appropriate to have dinner while you're in state to clear the air. His careful wording wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement that my position made me harder to ignore. I appreciate the invitation, I said, but if we're going to meet, we need an honest conversation about the past few years. The past is the past, Kennedy, he replied, impatient. Looking backward serves no purpose. It's not about looking back, I said firmly. You and Mom misrepresented my choices and portrayed me as a failure when I was succeeding. That needs acknowledgement before we can move forward. Another long silence. Perhaps we had different perspectives on your choices, he offered finally. It isn't about perspectives, I said. It's about respect. You punished me instead of supporting me. That hurt. His voice softened. Family is complicated. Perhaps we can start fresh. Your Senate role is impressive. We can build from there. It was classic for him. Conditional approval now that my success was undeniable. I need time, I said. If we meet, I'd want Logan there. He's my family now. As you wish, he answered stiffly. Sitting in my office afterward, emotions churned. Part of me wanted to reject the overture. Another part, the little girl who longed for approval, wanted to rush toward reconciliation. Logan helped me find the middle ground. You don't have to decide everything at once, he said. Set boundaries and leave the door open. 2 weeks later, we met in a private dining room. Logan sat beside me, steady. The conversation stayed mostly surface level. My committee work, Logan's job, our DC apartment renovations. Finally, my mother addressed our arrangement indirectly. We may not have always understood your choices, she said, but we never stopped caring. Caring isn't the same as respecting, I replied. You didn't just misunderstand, you denigrated my work. You told people I'd failed when I was succeeding. That's beyond misunderstanding. My father shifted. Perhaps we were hasty in our judgments, he offered, a close thing to an apology without admitting they were wrong. If you want to be part of my life, I said carefully, you need to respect the life I've built. My career, my marriage, my choices. I won't accept less. The dinner ended with tentative plans for future contact, but no real resolution. My mother hugged me stiffly and whispered, "We are proud of you, Kennedy," in her way, acknowledgement wrapped in condition. Ryan proved more complicated. A week after the gala, he asked to meet at a coffee shop near my district office. He looked different, less polished, more human. I owe you an apology, he said after we sat down, for the gala and for years of complicity. Complicity? I knew you were succeeding, he said. I didn't correct them. I didn't stand up for you. Why not? I asked, the question that had shadowed me for years finally spoken aloud. He looked down. It was easier not to. If you were the disappointment, I didn't have to question my own choices. I could be the success story without examining whether I was truly happy. And are you happy? I asked. He hesitated. I'm successful by their measure, he admitted, but watching you live by your principles made me question my path. That conversation didn't heal everything, but it opened a door. Ryan seemed genuinely interested in rebuilding a relationship on honesty, rather than appearances. Over months we exchanged occasional texts and calls, slowly rebuilding something separate from our parents' influence. The most unexpected reconciliation came from my grandmother, Grace. After the Gala revelation, she surprised me with a confession. She'd been following my career closely, saving clippings and watching hearings online. "I always believed in you," she told me over lunch at her assisted living facility. "But I was a coward. I should have defended you more openly." Her words mattered. She took my hand and, with fragile honesty, said, "Your grandfather questioned everything. Your father rejected that side to please his own father. When he saw it in you, it frightened him. It reminded him of the path he didn't take." That insight reframed much of my family's dynamics. Maybe my father's rejection had less to do with me and more to do with what I reflected back to him. As my first Senate term continued, I channeled those personal lessons into policy. I became a leading voice for family mental health resources and programs helping first-generation college students navigate institutions their families couldn't guide them through. My experience of building a life without family advantages gave me a different lens on the barriers others face. Logan and I began serious talks about starting a family. The prospect forced us to consider the kind of family culture we wanted. "I know exactly what I don't want," I told him. "I never want our child to feel love is conditional on following a prescribed path." "We'll make mistakes," Logan reminded me. "All parents do, we'll just make different ones than yours." Gradually, cautious reconnection with my parents and Ryan followed. Holidays were still strained, but genuine effort appeared on both sides. My mother started asking about my legislative priorities. My father awkwardly began forwarding articles about my work with brief notes of approval. On my 40th birthday, they hosted a small dinner at their home, the first invitation in over a decade. In the formal dining room where so much pain had once happened, my father surprised us by raising a glass. "To Kennedy," he said, voice rough with feeling, "who had the courage to define success on her own terms. You've made a difference beyond what we imagined." It wasn't a full apology, but it was sincere, an imperfect olive branch. I accepted it for what it was. Looking around that table, at my parents trying in their limited way, at Ryan questioning the family script, at Logan who had shown unconditional support, I realized relationships exist on a spectrum. Perfect reconciliation might not be possible, but something genuine could live in the middle ground. The deepest lesson wasn't just political or familial. It was about authenticity. By refusing to conform to someone else's measure of worth, I found my own. The path was harder and lonelier at times, but it led to a life aligned with my values, not theirs. Being underestimated became my strength. It forced me to trust my judgment, build resilience, and find value independent of others' approval. Those qualities shaped my public service and the more human work of living authentically. Have you ever been underestimated by people whose approval you craved? Did it break you or make you stronger? Often, our deepest wounds can become sources of power if we choose to forge our own way through them. Thanks for staying with this story. If it resonated, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear that being underestimated can become a superpower. Tell me in the comments about your experiences with family expectations. Sometimes sharing is the first step toward healing. Until next time, true success isn't measured by other people's standards, but by the courage to live authentically,